Hello, welcome everyone to episode 8 of the Hirewell Recruiting Insights podcast, also simulcast on LinkedIn Live. I'm your host, James Hornick, partner at Hirewell. This is a very special edition. It actually was a special request from some viewers of the test podcast I did, and I know there's a lot of people who are kind of anticipating it. My guest today is the author of the book, I'm Not Done. She's an expert in the field, or is it a field of ageism, or field understanding and combating ageism?
Right.
I tell you what, I will let you introduce yourself further, but special guest, Patti Temple Rocks.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here, and talking about this issue is one of my passions, so I always say yes to the opportunity to do so.
So it was really interesting because someone watching the last live, Matt, what's the last name again? Bicefield. Sorry, Matt. I knew I was going to slaughter your name if I tried to pronounce it. Actually connected us. So it's kind of a testament of the power of LinkedIn, which just kind of connections you can make. And Patty's local to Chicago here, and I like to kind of do with everything local. And I didn't realize how deep this issue was until that day where I did that live podcast. The amount of questions I was getting. And then after we met for coffee that one day, talking about it more, and then reading your book. And I definitely recommend everyone take a look at this. I'm sure you can get on Amazon and all the other places they sell books, which is just Amazon nowadays. But there's a lot to it. So I think the best way to start this conversation, and I want everyone out there, feel free to ask questions, and we'll try to hit on whatever we can. Do you want to maybe first tell us how you decided to write this book and kind of what your story was?
Sure. So I have been in the communications field for close to 4 decades now, and worked on the agency side and on the client side, and both advertising and PR agencies. So I really felt like I had a very good cross-section of experiences from a business standpoint. And one of the experiences that frankly caught me a little bit off guard, I think like a lot of us, I was just blissfully enjoying the peak of my career, in my late 40s, and had a big job and worked for a great boss, mentor, who actually was also a friend, who had become the first woman to sort of break through to the executive ranks at this Fortune 100 company that we both work for. And I was surprised when I felt like something changed, and it caught me off guard a little bit, and it just was very subtle, but she wasn't in some of the meetings that she used to be at. There was sometimes I felt like what she was saying was disregarded, and it never really had been before, and it just something felt off or uncomfortable for me. And I took the opportunity at a cocktail party with our CEO, who had put her in this job, so I knew he was a big advocate and a fan, to say, I wrote about her, I call her Angelina, not her real name, but in my book, and I said, I can tell something's going on with Angelina. Mm-hmm. What is it, and how can I help? And his response really caught me off guard, and he said, the first thing he said was, well, don't you see this could be good for you? Which was not, who wants to build their career on the back of someone else's short or problems. But then the second thing he said was, and I honestly just think Angelina might be tired. She's been at this business a long time. And I'm pretty sure at that time Angelina was 55. And anybody who knew her never, ever would have used the word tired to describe her, either at the time, ever in her career, or today, where quite honestly she's gone on and is, doing great. But I didn't understand at the time, but she was the victim of ageism to some degree. And tired is one of those euphemisms for older. Not technically, there's a whole lot of euphemisms out there, but it was really when I went from sort of blissful ignorance about ageism to thinking this might be a thing to pay attention to. And so I'll keep going, but just to get to where I ended up writing the book, because honestly, LinkedIn has a part of it. So thank you, LinkedIn world. But my choice at the time, so she ended up leaving the company, as I said, has done really well. She's on several public boards and teaches a course and is doing just fine, proving to all of us that she was certainly not tired. But I became very wary. And so I started to think, all right, I'm not going to let that happen to me. I'm going to manage this, and I'm going to go before anybody thinks it's time, or before anybody thinks I'm ready. And so at the time, all the popular literature, everything I could find were all these books about build your second act career, how to figure out what you might want to do next. And there were all sorts of things about volunteer organizations or, creating your own business, which is all of those are viable options for people. But I found that when I did find myself in that position, that's not what I wanted to do. I did not want to go.
Why is it assumed that you need to do something else when you hit a certain age?
Yeah. Exactly. And I thought, I'm not ready for a second act career because I'm still right in the thick of this first one. And so that's when I just thought, I'm going to keep going. I'm not done. And I literally wrote, so I left my job, and I sort of fast forwarded over this. The reason that I felt this way myself was that I was moved from a highly engaged, operational, in the business, every second of the day job to one that was less so. Yeah. So, again, I felt like I'd seen this happen to other people, and I just thought, this isn't what I want to do. So I left. And so during that time, first time in my career, I didn't have a job to go to. I started really doing a lot of thinking about what I wanted to do next, and sort of came to this conclusion. I may not be 100% sure what I want to do next. I just know I'm not done. Yeah. So I wrote a blog about it, which I hadn't really done before. I've done, writing more for myself or my teams or whatever. And I posted it on LinkedIn. And the response to it was literally overwhelming. I mean, I went from like, oh, look, 20 people liked it, to 200 people liked it, to 2,000 people liked it, close to 20,000 at one point were responding. And what they were responding to was the I'm not done part of it, my story. And they started telling me their own stories of I'm not done, this happened to me, I'm worried this is going to happen to me, this happened to my husband, this happened to my mother. Like, I just heard so many personal stories of people feeling like they had been marginalized or pushed out of their job before they were ready, that I knew I was onto something and I should write about it. So that was really what went from just something that I had a strong opinion about to a book, was because I saw how many people responded to it.
And I'm glad you said that too, because I think, and I always like to end with takeaways, but I don't think it's too early to say this, because I think you've mentioned it's the biggest issue is that no one talks about it. No one feels comfortable talking about it. Maybe people feel talking about it, maybe some individuals do to themselves, but the biggest issue is that companies don't feel comfortable having these kind of conversations and the more advanced conversation you need to have. There's a lot of aspects to this, and I don't know how much we're able to get through today, but the one that really struck me, which is, there's a few things I think are fundamental behind this, and the one is the cost aspect, the wage increase aspect. And I don't want to completely botch this, and because this is your field but not mine, but your book talked about, and you and I talked about, everyone's used to the tenure increase. So over time, cost of living, or just staying with a company long enough, your wage is going to increase whatever it is over time. If you stay at a company long enough, or you just get to a point in your career where you've been doing it long enough, your actual salary could perhaps outpace the level of work you're actually doing. Did I get that partially correct? Or
yeah, no, I mean, I think that's fair. And the main thing is, it would be completely unrealistic and frankly irresponsible to not have this conversation about ageism without talking about salary. It's like the polka dotted elephant in the room. And a lot of the reasons that older workers are pushed out of the workforce is basically, if you need to make cuts and you're looking at where your salary costs are, your salary costs of your more seasoned employees are typically higher than your salary costs of more junior employees. And that's for a reason, because they've built that experience, they've created a lot of value for the company. So I'm not suggesting that there comes a point where that's just an automatic, like, the salary's too high, you have to deal with something about it. It's different in every single situation. But I think not to sort of talk about that and recognize that for some people that might drive some decisions or even some perceptions about it is just unrealistic. And, it's less of an issue, and I think will continue to become less of an issue because more progressive companies are dealing with compensation differently. And so they're making the compensation come on more performance metrics or things like that, where tenure or age or those things should have nothing to do with it. But the older model, you're right, was basically...
And that's what I think is the challenge, is that companies who have that model, they don't know of any other ways. They're not advanced enough in their HR policies. They don't even know how to have that conversation with somebody. If they decide they need to, like, hey, we don't want... It's easier for them, and it shouldn't be, to make that kind of cut or make a change, versus actually having a human conversation with someone to figure out, like, is there a way we can, like, change your comp structure or something like that.
And I fully understand the awkwardness or the difficulty in potentially having that conversation if you are the employer. And so I got really great advice from a woman, an HR professional named Sarah, who I interviewed extensively for my book, and she had some really good advice, I think, for people in having that. But the one that sticks with me the most was, she said, it's not an awkward conversation if it happens all the time, which it should.
Yeah.
And so by that she means, if you are having the conversation, if nobody's talked to you really about your future goals or what you want to accomplish or what job you might like to do next for the last 5 or so years, and all of a sudden the first time they bring it up is after you've turned like 50 or 55 or whatever, and now all of a sudden for the first time they're saying, well, what are you thinking about? That's going to be, I don't necessarily have the same level of trust I do if we've been having those conversations all along.
Yeah.
And so that's, I think, one of the most important things, is to just, too many companies stop having career development conversations when people hit 40.
Yeah, and this was the other thing I want to make sure we hit on, because you were talking about kind of managing your own career, because a lot of times companies they're not doing that. They're not having performance reviews. And you mentioned you mentioned when we were talking before, a lot of older employees get stuck in that laying low trap. They just kind of want to keep their head down.
For sure. And one of my favorite examples, which I'll talk about, is a company that I think is doing this right. But for most of us, and with most of our employers, if we raise our hand and say, I'm thinking about retiring, I'm not sure when, but I think I'd like to retire sometime in the next 2 years. I'm just making that up. The fear of, okay, that means they're going to write me off. I'm not going to get any great opportunities for a new assignment or a new project. When they're delivering bonuses, they're not going to worry about retaining me because I've already told them I want to leave. So people are naturally inclined to want to keep that on the down low because they feel like the risk is too high. As someone said to me, once you've let that genie out of the bottle that you're thinking about retiring, you sort of can't put it in. So people tend to wait until the last possible moment to bring it up. And in that whole time that they're sort of waiting, they're also laying low and hoping that nothing should happen to sort of curtail the end of their career.
Yeah.
Company that I referenced, Herman Miller, recognized that was going on. They also did a audit of their employees, their workforce, which I recommend every company do, and discovered that they had a very large number of employees who were technically retirement eligible. And if all of those employees took retirement at the same time, they would have a serious labor shortage and a problem getting, delivering product to their customers. So at the same time, being a good advocate for their employees, they also realized that many of these employees who chose to wait until the last minute were sometimes not ready, either financially, emotionally. If you retire too early, there are literally known health problems that you're going to have. So they realized that something that was not in their best interest was also not in the best interest of employees. So they created a program, phased retirements. It's as logical as can be, but far too companies do it, where you basically are encouraged to, raise your hand, and it has to come from the employee, and say, I would like to manage my retirement in the next X years. And it can be anywhere from, 2 to 5. You could say, I would like to work 4 days a week. I would like to work on a special assignment. It doesn't mean the company has to say yes, but now you're at least having a healthy conversation that can match company needs with what an employee might want. You mitigate against the shock for the employee of having it happen too soon. Yeah. You allow that employee to help bring on their replacement, which is a best practice everywhere. It's a better transition when it's a smooth, steady one. And it just turned out to be a win-win for everybody. And the other thing that I want to encourage everybody who's thinking about this is, if you think that ageism impacts only your workers of, pick a number, 50 and older, 55 and older, you're wrong, because employees in their 30s and 40s are sort of watching what you do too. And so for Herman Miller, they found, even for their non-retirement age employees, they just had a much more positive view of their employer and their employer's compassion and willingness to deal fairly with their employees.
So I'm glad you kind of brought that up, because there were two things when you're talking about people in their 30s and 40s that it kind of struck me as, one, people should have a sense of urgency around this, because this is going to happen to you. This is going to happen to everyone. Everyone thinks it's not going to happen to them, or I'm going to be so rich by then it's not going to matter, or, everyone has something in the back of their head where no one wants to feel uncomfortable with a problem they know they're going to have to come up against someday. So, and the only way you're not going to have to deal with this someday is if you're insanely rich, which isn't going to be the overall majority of this, or something really unfortunate happens and you don't make it that long, right?
I always like to say aging is inevitable. Ageism is a choice. So we're all going to age, but we don't have to practice ageist behaviors or behave, or be part of an organization that embraces ageism. So you're right. Yeah. We're all going to get older. Knock on wood, hopefully. Yeah.
The other thing that I thought was interesting too is because I always look at things just because by nature as a recruiter from a talent perspective, and you've got unemployment at all-time lows, you've got companies struggling to hire good talent, yet you still have some of these same companies forcing people out, then complaining they can't find talent, and there's a weird dichotomy there. But the other thing that's interesting too, and I can tell you this is real just anecdotally from everyone I've ever talked to, but companies want to invest in younger employees. They want to hire the 3 to 5 year person because they see it as a good long-term investment in what they can do to build someone's future. Yet, I think it's pretty much proven someone who's 40 or above is far more likely to stay with a company long-term. You hire a 45-year-old versus a 25-year-old, which one's more likely going to last 15 years at your company? It's by far the 45-year-old. So it's a strange dichotomy to me when people think about building a long-term organization that, and this is not knocking on people who are younger, but it's very much, the hiring culture is very youth obsessed versus the reality of where, people of all ages have value and should be valued. But writing off, and you talked about development too, of people over the age of 40 pretty much stops, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense when the reality is that's where you have potentially more long-term bang for your buck.
And I think it's, again, there's all sorts of euphemisms, but I think that from a hiring standpoint, like when we talk about years of experience, and I feel this way from my years of experience as an employer, like when we describe the length of time that we want somebody to have worked before they come to us, that's a money. We're making that thing in our mind that says, okay, somebody that has had this many years experience, this is probably what their salary expectation is, and so, and again, I'm not necessarily saying that's wrong, except that I do think that it just forces us to think in incorrect ways about age. When that's what we should really get better at is understanding exactly, sort of what the specific skills and expertise that we need somebody to do. And then why would we care how old they are if they're willing? And you decide how much that's worth. So if I know I want somebody that's going to come into my organization and deliver value in these 10 areas, and I should also know how much that's worth to me, then that's what I'm going to pay. And so I should be completely open-minded to somebody who's willing to do those things for that salary, regardless of any factors about them whatsoever. And I think too often we make the assumption that, well, that person's got 20 years experience, they're going to get bored, they're going to quit, they're not going to do it. How do you know until you really clearly define outcomes and match a dollar figure to it?
What I'm interested in, and I don't know what the effect's going to be, and I don't know the answer to this, but the no salary history law that was passed in Illinois, I think could combat part of this. Because there's always a factor, and I can say this from a recruitment standpoint, when companies want to know what someone's making, and they'll definitely base part of their decision on whether they're going to hire somebody just based upon if they think they can afford them long term, or there's always that fear if you're let's just make up numbers, but if your salary you're able to pay is $100,000 and this person was making 120, like taking age out of it, there's always that fear that we can't offer that person this job because they're going to find something that pays more, pretty soon they'll leave us in a minute. But if you don't know if they're making $120,000 anymore, now that's taken out of the equation. So I'd be curious, because I do think I talk to people all the time who know that they're well paid and know they can't expect to get that in their next job. Like there's a certain salary level where you have to prove yourself no matter what. But at the same time, I think there are a lot of companies that just still, they saw it as a risk and wouldn't give people that opportunity to take a step back, even though that person really didn't care. Maybe they care about They care about the quality of the work. They care about what they like to do. They care about other factors and benefits. They care about healthcare, which is another thing that I know you mentioned is a big factor for people of a certain age. But with that taken out of the equation, I'm curious, like, it'll have a positive effect. I'm just not sure how much.
Yeah, and I think it's also, I would love to see, I mean, if again, just using my own career history and trajectory as my evidence, I guess, is that I think that for a long time, we've defined success in like time-related increments, either years of experience or how hard somebody works. Or I used to laugh, like I can't remember how many performance reviews that I would read or review that somebody was giving where they wanted to give somebody an increase based on they work overtime all the time, or they're always coming in on the weekends, or they're doing this. And I thought, at some point we have to ask ourselves, but are they good?
Yeah.
Or did they get the job done? Or did they deliver, in my case, it's often clients. Did they deliver real value to clients? Or are we so used to sort of blood, sweat, and tears kind of measurement that we reward time in the job or time at the desk or time at the office? And I think as we've moved more towards a remote working and all these flexibility things, it should force us to become much more clear on what exactly is the job to be done.
Yeah.
And how much is that, I know I'm repeating myself, but how much is that worth to my client or to my company? And then that's what I want to do. And then it just becomes, fewer assumptions are made when we're able to be that specific about deliverables.
Do you have any thoughts on job seekers specifically? Because I know that's a lot of people who probably follow me on LinkedIn. There are a lot of them are people who are looking for jobs or people hiring. And I know there's some of the people I talked to recently have asked me ever since we kind of brought this topic up a couple weeks back, advice I have when they're facing ageism or whatnot, it's another topic entirely. But I didn't know if you had any thoughts or anything you wanted to share. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask. We can do our best to answer. So.
Well, I'm like firmly like in the middle on this, and here's what I mean by that. I interviewed some recruiters and talked to some people, and there are practical things that we're telling people to do, like take the year you graduate from college out. Don't list every single job that you've ever had. Don't flag to the potential employer things that would necessarily show that you're 50 plus or whatever number we want to put out there. And part of me, though, thinks that this is not really going to help solve the problem, because it defies everything that I've just said. It shouldn't matter. Yeah. It's really about the work. But on the other hand, until we're there, until we are to a place where ageism, I like to say, because it's true, it's sort of the last socially acceptable ism out there. But until we get to the point where we get just as incensed about somebody being kept out of a job because of their age as we do about somebody being kept out of a job because of their gender or their race, then I got to give the advice to the job seeker to try to minimize that a little bit. And ultimately we'll get there, but for now, I wouldn't flag it, I
did have a couple of things I put together because I had to think about this too. Like someone asked me a question I really couldn't answer on the spot. So 2 weeks later, and it ends up being a lot of the same advice I usually give for a lot of the stuff anyway. But I think that, to your point, the fix is on the company level. Like a job seeker can't fix this problem. They can only minimize their risk and do the best they can. The real fix is when that same person is working at a company, what they can do internally to make some noise, to see change. And I see this, not to turn this into like a much lamer topic, is people always asking, well, like ghosting always comes up when people like interview for a job, they never hear back, But my point is that everyone has been ghosted on at some point in time, yet all those same people, when it comes to their own company that's still ghosting on people, don't do anything about it, Like if people who get so incensed when they get ignored at their own company took action, that's actually how the problem would get fixed. And I think that ageism, which is a much more serious topic, is kind of the same way. Like by the time you're looking for a job, that's not the time the problem gets fixed. The way the problem gets fixed is when you're actually working at the company and then you actually do something about it, because that's where you have a voice. That being said, if I am a job seeker, so thinking about this more, I think that you can't, if a company is going to discriminate against you based on age or anything else, there's nothing you can actually do about that. The only way you can have a successful job search is making sure you're actually getting in front of enough companies who don't take that view. And I think that, and I mentioned this to you when we met the last time, and it's kind of a joke, but it's true, is that most people especially the longer you go in your career and the less job changes you make, the probably worse you are at interviewing, right? Like you just don't do it very often. And I think, so there's two things. One, people need to take, I think when I talk with someone when I ask them how their job search is going or what they've done so far, they say, well, I've submitted a bunch of resumes to Indeed and whatnot. I think they're already behind the 8 ball because everyone's submitting resumes to Indeed. That's the easiest way to go about things. And when people only do that and don't see results, taking a more active approach where the goal is to get in front of people, whether it's for an interview or whether it's just a networking meeting. And I've said this a bunch of times where your goal should be able to find what companies you have interest in, find a large list of companies, and approach people there who are at the right level and just try to network with them. Ask them for advice, ask them out over coffee. If you ask a senior level person for advice, they're way more likely to get back to you and want to talk with you and meet for coffee than they are, hey, can I have a job? Then they're like, no, go talk to HR, right? We've all seen that like a million times. But making sure you're taking a more proactive stance in terms of doing networking and getting in front of people and having that be your metric by which you say how well your job search is going and not by how many resumes sent out. Because ultimately, when you're up against, if you're afraid that you're being held back because of ageism, you just need to get in front of more good people. Your resume is not going to sell you. You have to sell you. People have to see what kind of person you are, what kind of energy you have about you. And this is any age, right? Like you're in a way better chance of getting a job once you just have met with somebody, sure. Especially when that's before the job description is even written before they post it. That's the best time to get in is if you can meet with people who know they have something on the horizon and then they have you in mind for that role before it even gets to that stage where everyone else is applying.
Yeah. And you're touching on, like, I have two things that I really care passionately about when people, I want to make sure that they, don't come away with a mistaken impression. Number one, there was a time, I think, when there was to some degree like a gold watch mentality when you would put in your time at your career and then, could ride it out and get your gold watch and retirement package and go home. Like that, those days are long gone. And so this ageism is not a cover or should never be considered a reason not to be damn good at your job. Like every single day you have to be damn good at your job. And again, as you say, that's regardless of your age. We still have an obligation to understand what the job requires and do it better than anybody else and deliver value. Somebody gave me advice early in my career that said, just make sure that every night you go home, you feel really good that you earned that paycheck today. And I've always tried to live my career that way. Like I earn my paycheck every day because every day is sort of a new day. And the other point, just that because you mentioned this about regardless of any age, like this is not a zero-sum game of old people versus young people. The workforce needs all of us.
Yeah.
And so this is not, and sometimes part of the challenge with people being moved into different roles is to make room for younger employees to learn and grow, and that all needs to happen. I just want to make sure that when the older people get moved, they get moved someplace good.
Yeah.
Not just out of the way.
Yeah, no, I agree. And looks like we have a question here. Would you recommend that we should keep LinkedIn profiles trimmed to the same number of years experience that are in the resume?
So, I guess that's probably more your answer as a recruiter. It feels like you don't want something to not. I think
honestly, I always
consistent.
Say just have a match. I don't. My answer to that is don't overthink. I don't think there should be any variation in it. Like if anything, I think you don't need to be as detailed in terms of what you put into the LinkedIn description. But I've always said to just make sure your LinkedIn profile mirrors whatever your resume says.
Yeah, that seems logical to me. And I honestly, as I think about all the blood, sweat, and tears I put into resumes over the year. Like I think of the last probably 20 positions I've hired from a LinkedIn profile, not a resume.
Yeah. I could go on a rant about how much I hate reading resumes. But,
I'm sure.
It's just just give me the high points, because so many words. I had one other thought too about job seeking. And this is kind of this is also something I think is general, but I think if there is one way that we as peers fail each other, it's that I think we have there's a natural human tendency to always give positive affirmation feedback to give everybody an attaboy. Hey, you did a great job. That sounds wonderful. Resume looks great. Oh, yeah, to give that answer, you're going to kill it. It's because people don't feel comfortable giving, I don't want to say harsh, but any kind of negative criticism to a friend or peer or family member when it's easier just to say, oh, sure, it sounds great. But when you're talking about an interview process, and when you only get one shot, and if you're struggling with your job search and you might only be one company interested in you, you have to make sure you nail it. And I think making sure and taking advantage of, and this is kind of going back to my previous point about how people most of us aren't that good at interviewing because they don't do it enough, not because we're bad at interviewing, just because we don't have enough practice. That's what you need is practice. You need to make sure you've got people you can rely on and tell them, hey, I want to do a mock interview, or there are groups out there that do this kind of stuff. That way, when you actually get in front of somebody, you're well rehearsed, you can actually nail it, as opposed to, I think and the reason why I bring that up, I think you have to make sure you tell people, hey, I want harsh feedback. Don't tell me I'm doing a good job, but let's do a real interview, because I need to make sure this interview I have going on, I do a great job in, because the opportunities it's not an age thing, but it's also a seniority thing in terms of, if you're at a VP level, if you're at a director level, there's just less VP jobs out there. You're going to get less looks, not because of age per se, but just because of the level of experience you have. So when those opportunities come up, you can't afford to miss. So make sure you rely on your peer network, but make sure your peer network is being honest with you. And if you have someone out there who's doing a job search like this, don't BS them and say, oh, it sounded great. Make sure you're actually giving them true feedback.
And the feedback thing, I think, is actually important, not just in the job search area, but also on the job. And as I said, for a lot of people, sometimes the regular sort of check-ins about performance and things like that just aren't as consistent as they age. So that 40-year-old, 45-year-old who suddenly then finds themselves put in a job that feels like I'm being put to pasture, doesn't feel as meaningful, probably many of them have not had any feedback that would let them know maybe their performance has not been what it needs to be, but they haven't really been given the feedback. So then by the time they're just sort of marginalized out, it's going to feel very much like ageism to them. And maybe it wasn't, but they didn't get the honest feedback. The communication
was so poor that they couldn't. Maybe they could have changed something. Maybe they could have improved, and they just never given the opportunity. So
exactly.
One thing about your book, I liked everything about your book, but one thing I liked about your book, at the very end, you have 10 points of what companies can do to change, which I think is really what this whole thing's about, is companies have to take a vested interest in this. And I don't want to have you recite your 10-point checklist, but are there 1, 2, or 3 points that you think if people watching this go home and want to address with their company, what are the key things people could do or should do or companies should do?
Well, I think it's I'll do 3, so that's a great number. And one of them is this is actually a different chapter, but it's one of the things that you should do. But it's a chapter in my book called the mirror test, and that is to just take an objective and honest look at your organization, if you're part of the leadership of that organization, to assess whether or not you might be, and like any bias, a lot of this is unconscious, but whether you might be behaving in more ageist ways than you even realize. I mean, there's a difference between ageism and age discrimination. And age discrimination is flat out illegal, and you could put your company at great risk for financial harm and all the rest of that. Ageism is a little bit more subtle. It can lead to age discrimination, but it's also just lots of microaggressions or lots of small behaviors that just would tell somebody from the outside looking in, boy, this company doesn't necessarily value its older employees. Yeah. And, little things like, is your website full of nothing but young, shiny faces? Even though maybe you employ people of all ages, but you're choosing to only show sort of the young, shiny faces. This is a silly example, but I talk about it because it's from my own experience where, for a long time we had holiday parties that were very much geared towards, all our outings and social things were geared towards millennials, and some of the older workers just didn't really choose to come or whatever. And we realized if we just don't have everyone be that way, change a little bit, we're going to get a much broader representation of people coming to our social functions. I mean, it's such a small, subtle thing that people can do that. The second thing, well, I want to end with the last one because I think it's the most powerful thing people can do. But another thing that I think companies need to do is, in addition to the mirror test, which is much more specific, let's look at that, but just pay attention to the signals around them. Like if all of a sudden you notice that an employee is less engaged, ask why. And train your supervisors to ask why and sort of notice that, because one of the things, back to laying low, like a lot of employees feel this and don't talk about it. because they want to lay low. Like, well, if I have to say, boy, I'm really starting to feel like George is starting to, like, he's made some, comments about my gray hair or this, that, or the other, but I don't want to complain about it because maybe, Phyllis, who I work for, hasn't noticed that I'm getting older. And so that people just tend to sort of not report things, but you can observe them and notice them and talk about them yourself. But the most basic of all, and you brought it up early in our conversation, is just have the conversation. Like, don't stop talking to workers when they reach a certain age about their career and what they want to get out of it, because then as long as you keep that conversation going, when they get to the end of our careers, all our careers are going to end at some point, and we just want to have more of a say in how that happens. And so if you're having an honest conversation with me about my career, I might recognize that it's time for somebody else to come in and take my job. And I might have some thoughts about something else that I could go. I might be willing to take less money to do that. There could be so many positive outcomes from having the guts to have that conversation in the first place. But it's just not happening very often. So I just think the reward for having the conversation could be epic if employers we're willing to start doing so. Absolutely. Is there anything else you wanted to hit on before we let you go today? Any other points? We talked about a lot. So yeah, no, we did. I love hearing from people. Makes me want to keep talking. This started out as a book for me. Well, it started out as a blog, as I said, and then a book. But now I really feel like it's become a bit of a mission. So I'm always happy to continue talking about it. And I. Even though some of them make me cringe, I do like hearing the stories from people about what they've experienced, because I think, the more we're able to help educate people. I also believe in my heart that a lot of this is unconscious, and that when people know better, they'll do better. And so I feel like our job right now is to just make sure that people know better. Okay. So we're going to wrap this up for this week. I always have to read this kind of scripted text because it's going to sync up with our podcast. But before I do that, once again, the book, I'm Not Done, Patti Temple Rocks. Check it out on Amazon. And again, once again, thanks for listening to Hirewell's Recruiting Insights podcast. If you like what you heard and want more insights from our recruiting experts, visit hirewell.com/recruiting-insights. Remember to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. And see you guys soon.